Welcome. My name is Mr. Abbott. Today I'm going to be talking about considering your audience when you are writing your argumentative essay. And your audience is really who you are writing for. Now, while you may not have considered who your audience may be before in the past, it's essential that you start considering it as of this moment. And so, once again, it's just who are you imagining you're talking to? If you imagine you're talking to everybody, then you're going to reach very few people. Typically, you want to target your audience to a more specific group. There's a couple of vocabulary words that you're going to pick up during this presentation, such as audience, demographics, bias, skepticism, the single story, and stereotype. You should review this video multiple times if you do not pick up the definition, or view other videos about those topics if they believe that those will help you. And so let's start by putting this in context. Do you talk with your friends in the same way you talk to your parents? Odds are you don't. Would you speak with a police officer the same way you would talk to a McDonald's employee? Odds are you don't. These people require different methods of communication in order to reach them, and different expectations for that communication. And whether or not you're successful in communicating with somebody often has a great deal to do with how you are trying to talk to them. And it's no less true when you are writing. When you're writing, the way you are writing to somebody is going to have a great effect on whether or not your message is received by them. And so one of the first things you may choose to consider when you're writing is to look at people's demographic status. Things such as their age, race, income, education, gender, location in the world, interest, religious or political party can greatly influence how your argument will be perceived. And so kids, each group will have different values, biases, goals, fears, and expectations. And really knowing what those things are is essential in reaching those people. And so the first thing you really want to consider is, what is your relationship to the reader? Would this reader relate to you as a member of the same group as them, right? And what level of trust would they inherently have in you? If they would see you as the member of the same social group or some other kind of group, they're going to inherently trust you a little bit more. But if they see you as somehow foreign or outside, you're going to have to work to build up that trust. And this is something that you need to understand before you put a single word onto the paper. You have to know who you're writing to and how you're going to be perceived. And so some areas to consider when writing to a specific audience. You need to think of what level of formality or informality they would prefer in their communication. You have to consider what the safe and risky topics are. You have to think about their degree of skepticism or their biases, areas of knowledge and ignorance, and their hopes and fears. And let's take a look at some of these things that I mentioned here. First off, level of formality and informality. Different groups in the world are going to want you to communicate with them in different ways. Some groups will view strict academic English as an absolute requirement. If you say ain't, or if you say, some other colloquial term, they're going to look at you and be like, oh, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. They don't know how to write. They don't know how to speak. They haven't been educated, and so I'm not going to listen to them because I don't trust them. On the other hand, some people might view strict academic English as a negative. They might see people who speak in complete sentences that are ready for the American classroom, American university. They might see those people as being too big for themselves or talking down to them. And if you use that with those groups, they're not going to listen to your message because they're going to think that you're not quite taking them seriously, or you're joking with them or pretending to be better than them. And so you have to understand what level of formality or informality your reader really wants from you as a speaker. Another thing you really want to consider are, what are the safe and risky topics to approach with this group with. So typically safe topics somehow adhere to that group's beliefs, and it confirms really what they already believe is true. Typically when you're reaching safe topics with a group, you can just say it and they'll widely accept it. But you also have to understand what the risky topics are. And it usually goes outside the group's beliefs, or it's likely to counter something they believe is true. And if you know that you're going to be hitting a risky topic with your audience, you need to prepare and you need to lead them step by step into the process. You can't just put it in front of them and be like, listen, that thing you thought was wrong is wrong. They're going to be like, no, it's not, and you don't know what you're talking about. But if you lead them slowly into the argument, because you know it's a risky topic, you're much more likely to reach that group. Another thing you want to consider will be their degree of skepticism and bias, and this typically has to do with risky topics. And so anything you say in your argument might be met with some degree of skepticism or bias, but it's an extent of how much. Is it going to be something that's impossible for this audience to believe? And if so, you may want to reconsider putting it in your essay to them. It might be something that you would approach them with later on after you've gained their trust. But if you know that if your argument is going to be met with skepticism, you're going to have to build a lot of rapport with your audience before you can try and sell that difficult topic. You got to make them feel like you're one of them, right? I mean, if you look at the 2016 election, you have a member of of a privileged group, Donald Trump, born into wealth, lives a wealthy life. This guy is not in the same social class as many of his most loyal, followers, I guess. But he's gone out of his way to convince them that he built a rapport with them that is so strong that they're willing to believe him over all other sources. And so it really, it really just depends building that relationship with somebody. And when you're writing to somebody, you're always building a relationship with them first. And once that relationship is built, then you want to try and approach the more dangerous things. But that's only if you're writing to an audience that's unlikely to believe you. If you're writing to an audience that already more or less believes what you say and you're just giving them new information, you don't need to do this as much. But it's important that you realize whether or not your audience is going to meet you with skepticism or bias or not. Another thing you want to consider is your audience's areas of knowledge and areas of ignorance. And this is important because if your audience has an area of knowledge, you don't need to go and over explain things that that group would already understand. And so, if you're talking to a group of astrophysicists, you probably don't need to tell them what Einstein's theory of relativity is and why it works or how it works. Whereas another group, you might need to explain that. The astrophysicists, if you start explaining to that, you're going to lose that to them. You're going to lose their interest. They're going to be like, "Yeah, we know this. Tell us something new." You know, uh, and so you can actually even then use that. And if you know you're writing to a group of astrophysicists, you can use metaphors that relate to astrophysics to help make comparisons and help them understand. On the other hand, if you know your audience has an area of ignorance, you're probably going to have to do extra work explaining things in your essay or in your argument to them. So that way, when you tell them about something, they know more about the subject and they can understand what you're saying. And so once again, it's just about understanding your audience and knowing what they do and don't know, what they will accept and what they won't easily accept. And in order to do this, you just have to first identify your audience. Finally, when it comes to really convincing your audience of something, it is essential to know their hopes and fears. And so if you can connect your argument to their hopes and make whatever you're saying seem like it'll increase the chances of their hopes coming true, it's going to do a great job in helping to convince them to believe you. If you can avoid connecting your argument to their fears or somehow connect your argument in a way that makes their fears less, they're once again going to believe you. But if you don't connect your argument to their hopes and you do connect it to their fears, then they're immediately going to turn off and not stop listening to you, right? So, for instance, there are a lot of people who own guns in the United States. They have the right to by the Second Amendment. Those people, they really hope that they will continue to have rights to gun ownership, and they really fear that those rights will be taken away from them. And so if you start talking about gun control in a way that makes them fear that you're saying that overall all guns should be taken away, they're going to tune out. They're going to stop listening to you. And so you want to make sure that if you're talking to that audience that you avoid that fear or you address that fear right off the bat. And it all comes about by first identifying who your audience is. Now, whichever group you are writing to, it is essential that you take their interests seriously. If you don't respect the group, if you don't understand why the group believes what they believe, they're going to think that you're secretly making fun of them, or that you are just lying to them, or you have some kind of motive or some agenda for them, right? You don't want to consider your group as being less than you. And if you're writing to a group who you consider to be idiotic, or if you consider them to that their point of view is somehow wrong, you really need to consider whether or not you want to write to them. You know you're ready to write to an audience once you understand why they believe what they believe. If you can understand and you can say, well, I could see why somebody would think that, even if you don't agree with it, that's where you want to be when you're writing to an audience. That means you're ready to write to them because you're taking them seriously and you understand their point of view. Only then do you really want to write to an audience that you don't really agree with. I want to take a minute and watch this TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, where she really talks about what she calls the single story. And this is what I was referring to when I was saying that you need to make sure that you understand and you can relate to the audience you're writing to. Oftentimes, when you have only a single story about a person, you won't really be able to write to them effectively. But in order to explain what the single story is and why it's important, I'm going to let Ms. Adichie talk to you about that.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books. But because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination, they opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this: it saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the Black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places. But I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Thailand, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Okoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who were not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I am confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and a kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
All right. And so from that video, hopefully you saw that it was mainly about what would be considered a stereotype. And so this is a widely held but oversimplified image or idea of a particular person or thing. And so what Ms. DJ was talking about was that when we only tell one story about somebody, we kind of limit their full picture. And this is kind of a natural thing for humans to do, because when you sit down and you think that every single person, all 7 billion people on the planet, each are living their own lives with their own strengths and weaknesses, their own hopes and fears, part of a group but not part of a group, living their own life full of complexity, of things that are bothering them, things that they hope for, things that, it would blow our minds to like literally think about that. Every single person is living a similar life to us across the world. Our brain can't really handle it. So we have this tendency to kind of create oversimplified images for everybody else in the world. And this can be helpful because it can help, to identify groups and get a quick idea of how you might interact with somebody, but it can also be really harmful because it can limit people's ability to be seen as full and authentic people. Stereotypes built from firsthand knowledge or multiple authentic sources are really powerful. You can use those to have a really well-informed idea of who somebody is and how you might interact with them. Whereas student stereotypes built from rumor, prejudice, politics will typically make your writing weak and will probably backfire on you if you don't really understand your group. Like the speaker was saying, you want to have a wide variety of stories from that group. And if you only have one, you're not going to be able to really understand what those people think or feel or what they hope. And so the speaker ends up saying that the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but that they're incomplete. They're only a small part of somebody's story. As a writer, in some ways, you'll be harnessing stereotypes to kind of write to your audience. You want to talk to general trends in that audience, but your stereotypes should be fair and balanced. They should focus on positive stereotypes and make sure you're not using just a single negative story that somebody is telling in order to malign a group to focus on. And so let's take a look at some groups you might have a single story of and ask yourself. So look at the Make America Great red hat wearing Trump crowd. Do you have a single story about who these people are? Or can you tell me what level of formality would they want from you as a speaker? What are safe and dangerous topics to approach them with? What are their skepticisms? What are their biases? What are their areas of expertise and ignorance? And if you look at this group and you're like, well, they don't have any expertise, they just have ignorance, you probably can't write to them yet. You don't understand this group quite as well as you need to before you're getting able to write to them. What are their hopes and fears? If you really wanted to reach a member of this group, you need to first understand, well, and look at them and be like, well, I guess I understand what they're saying, and I understand why they're afraid, and I understand what they're looking at. And if you get to that point, now you're ready to write to this group, right? But if you're not there, you probably shouldn't yet. The same thing could be said about the Black Lives Matter group. Looking at them, ask yourself, do you only have one story about who they are and what they want? If you look at them and you were to ask, like, what are their areas of expertise and ignorance, you say, no, they just have ignorance, they don't have any expertise. You are not ready to write to this group. You don't understand them. If you don't understand what their hopes and fears are, if you can't look at them and say, well, they have a point, and I understand why they're upset, it means you don't understand this group and you need to hear more of their stories before you're ready to write to them. And so all of this has to do with first identifying your audience. And once you're done identifying your audience, get an idea of what they want from you. And so let's look back at some of the vocabulary we've gone over in this lesson. Hopefully you understand who your audience is and what an audience is in general, what it means to be, what demographics are, bias, skepticism, a single story, and a stereotype. If you know what these words are, you're probably good to move on to the assignment. If you don't recognize all these words, you may want to do further research or watch this video again. Let's take a look at some of your assignments. All right, hello everybody. Now we're here looking at your analyzing audience assignment. And I want you to take a look at 3 different audiences and ask yourself more questions about them. And so I've separated into 3. And so if you scroll down on the assignment, you'll find them. So audience 1 is your parents. Audience 2 is your friends. And audience 3 is your teachers. And we want to really think about, if we were to address these different groups and talk to them, what do we need to consider, right? And so the first thing you need to consider is, are you going to be considered to be an insider or an outsider if you're writing to this group? So your personal relationship with your parents, would you consider yourself to be an insider or an outsider, right? I should actually say parents or guardians. Your language preference. When you're talking with this group, would your parents prefer that you speak in strict academic English, or would they prefer some more colloquial version of English or some other language entirely? What are the safe topics that you can talk to this group about that they will easily accept and not really hassle you on? What are the trigger topics that if you were to go talk to your parents, what do you know would trigger them instantly before you can even talk about it? What are their skepticisms and bias? What are they unlikely to believe? And what preferences would this group show? And what are the areas of knowledge and areas of ignorance? And what does this group hope for? And what does this group fear? Now, these are all things that you need to consider when you're thinking about your audience, because if you have a flat version of your audience in your head, like let's say you have your teachers, right? And your perception of them, and you're just like, well, my teachers they just hate me, and they don't really care. They just want to get their paycheck and go home. It's a very flat perception that you're not really doing your audience justice, because instead of looking at who your teachers are actually as a group, what you're considering instead is your stereotype of those teachers. And that's fine if you want to have that stereotype in your head, but just know it's going to make it harder for you to reach and convince your audience, right? Because there will be times when you need to convince your teachers or your parents or your friends of something that you think is important. And the better you understand this audience and what they hope and what they fear and what they are going to accept and what they're going to reject, the more you'll be able to have a discussion with them that's going to go the way that you want it to. Because this is really what it's all about. It's all about being able to convince somebody of your point of view or the thing that you want. You want people to agree with what it is that you want or need. Because in this world, you can't just force people to agree with you. You need to kind of convince them and persuade them to agree with you. And this is what persuasion is all about. And the first step of persuasion is understanding your audience. Let's take a look at one more thing I want you to do with this assignment. All right, and here we are back at your essay. Now, just like we did with the claim here at the top on the previous lesson, what I want you to do on this assignment is I want you to give me some more information about who you're writing to. And so let's just go right below that claim piece there. Scroll down so this is a little bit more centered. I'm going to put audience, and I want you to tell me specifically who is the audience you are writing to. If you're choosing a well-established topic like gun control, right? You may want to write, I'm writing to people who are pro-gun control, or I'm writing to gun rights activists, right? Which group in particular are you writing to? Who is it that you imagine reading this essay? And the more specific audience, the better. It really, if you're writing to a general audience, that's okay, and we can address that. But typically when you're writing, you want to reach a specific group of people. And if you write to everybody, you're going to reach nobody. So you want to write to have a really specific idea in mind of who you're writing to. So my audience for this one is specifically high school students, right? Um, that's who I had in mind when I was writing this. I was tailoring my language and my evidence and my reasoning to high school students and things that they could think about. If I had a different audience, I'd probably have to change the paper a little bit. And so this is the last thing I want you to do for your audience assignment. Is just go into your essay and tell me who was the audience that you imagined when you were writing this paper. And if you didn't imagine an audience while you're writing this paper, if you were to write this paper again, who would your audience be? Odds are most of you, when you wrote your first copy of your essay, you didn't have a specific audience in mind. So let's get that in there and let's add audience here below claim. If you didn't do this first part with the claim, you need to go back and do the first assignment and follow the instructions that I gave you. And then hopefully you'll have this audience addition in here as well. And so that way, once again, when I'm workshopping your essay, I don't have to ask you who is your intended audience. I'll just know when I've read it, and I can just talk about whether or not you're probably reaching your audience. And so let's add this to your first essay. And thank you, everybody, and good luck on your assignment.